month. This month we have Jim Kempton, the president of the California Surf Museum, and he's going to be talking about surfing in San Diego. So let's give a hand for Jim.
Thank you, Annan. Just a couple of questions before I start. How many of you are surfers out there? I saw someone with a, wow! I saw someone with a surf jacket on back there, so I knew that I wasn't.
Is the question are or were?
Okay, anything counts on that one. So quite a few people, well that's good. And how many of you are originally surfing in San Diego? All of you? Great. Well then, as you may know, and the others of you may know too, surfing has a really rich heritage in San Diego. It's one of the three major centers of surfing in California, and a very, very important one, and often one that is overlooked, partly because the media is centered in Orange County. That was where Surfer Magazine started, and like everything else, like Fleet Street or Wall Street or wherever someone starts doing what they do, everyone seems to cluster, that type of activity into that same area. And so all the media still really exists, for the most part, in southern Orange County, in Dana Point, San Clemente, and Newport Beach, in that area. So Orange County got an overload of coverage from the very beginning of surfing in California, and other places got short shrift, specifically Santa Cruz and San Diego, which were the furthest places away from that. Los Angeles and Malibu got them, but really San Diego, one of the great things about it is that it has an enormous wealth of different kinds of surf breaks. So you can go to Imperial Beach and the Tijuana Sloughs, which now, because of pollution, no one surfs anymore, but was an area that was very well received in the early days, all the way to Trestles, which is technically in San Diego County. So it's the borderline that crosses it. So for San Diegans, they like to claim it as part of San Diego. And between that, that is points and big bays and beach breaks and reefs all through. And it probably has the most consistent surf of anywhere in California. It gets all different types of swells, and when you look at the NOAA buoys, which are the ones that tell you about what the swell directions is and what size are from the National Nautical System, where they have buoys out recording all of this stuff, you can see that San Diego picks up swells from every single direction at all seasons of the year. So it's probably the most consistent wave field on the California coast, and because of that, it has a lot of opportunity for people who are here to excel at what they were doing. It also had a very relatively affluent society here from the very beginning, and it was built around leisure activities, tourism, etc. From the beginning, they were always trying to build that into the city's infrastructure. So the very first person that sort of popularized surfing in California, and by the way, San Diego, and I'm gonna mention them each time there is, but San Diego has an enormous number of firsts in surfing history, and so I'm gonna just highlight them when I come to them. But the very first exhibition that was given was in 1910, and that was with George Freeth. And George Freeth was a half Hawaiian, half European stock person, born in Hawaii, raised in Hawaii. And when Henry Huntington was trying to develop all of his different housing developments, many of them were at the beach, i.e. Huntington, Redondo, etc. So he invited George Freeth, who was the president of the Hawaiian Surfing Hui, they call it, or the organization, the club there, to come and give demonstrations, which he did. And that was the very first time that people in San Diego sort of got to see surfing. But before that, San Diego has the notable point of having the oldest surfboard that we know of today, and it was done. It was brought here or I should say the materials were brought here from Hawaii by a gentleman named Ralph Nociet. And he was a sea captain in the Navy, and when he was in Hawaii, he saw people surfing, and this was in 1903, and he asked if he could get some wood, some Hawaiian pine. Most of the boards there were made out of koa wood, which is Hawaiian redwood. But he asked if he could bring some Hawaiian pine because it was a lot lighter, and he shaped a board here and started surfing on it back in 1903. That was the very first time that anyone was surfing in San Diego. And his board is the only board we know of that's still left. Now in 1898, 3 Hawaiian princes came to Santa Cruz, and they had big 12 to 18 foot redwoods that they had shaped that they rode up there. But those boards are long lost to history now. Nobody knows what happened to them, but I'm sure they were just left somewhere when they left and never to be found again. But as that time went on, surfing began to be popular, and it's amazing how long people have been surfing in California. We think of Hawaii as being the place, and we think of sort of the birth of modern surfing in the late 50s, when the movie Gidget came out, and when John Severson started Surfer Magazine. But really, people had been surfing here from even the teens. But certainly in the 20s, people were surfing in Southern California, and there were probably like a couple hundred people between Santa Cruz and San Diego that were surfing at that time. And they all had their old jalopies, and they all traveled the coast looking for places, because in those days with the longer boards, they could only surf certain places. The number of spots that were surfable in their mind were a lot less, because they needed a rolling kind of Waikiki wave to surf boards that were over 10 foot. And I'm sure if any of you have surfboards that once you get past 10 foot, it's a whole different style of surfing. It doesn't fit the curvature of the wave, and so it's very easy to crash and burn, as we say. At that time, in about 1928, a gentleman named, you can go ahead and switch, sorry. A gentleman named Emil Seeger started surfing, and he took a board from a gentleman named Charlie Wright. They're both in this picture here. Oh, no, sorry. They're both in this. That's George Freet, by the way, that you just saw there. And he's the one that came over and gave it. But these gentlemen here were San Diego surfers, and they were guys that had started surfing on the old wooden boards. And the interesting thing about that is that Charlie Wright was a lifeguard, and he met this young gal named Faye Baird. And Faye and Charlie started up a romance. Charlie was always trying to talk her into getting a date, and she never wanted to date him. She was only 15. So he said, well, why don't I take you surfing? And that was music to her ears. So she started surfing with him, became an amazing surfer. And in 1927, they did an exhibit at Mission Beach when it was a casino then, was built right on Pacific Beach, right at Crystal Pier. And they did this exhibition. It was a New Year's Eve. They did it without wetsuits. You can turn a couple of those now, and you'll get to, I think, to Faye. So here's Faye and Charlie right there with their big wooden board. And they went out on New Year's Eve and surfed in front of a crowd of thousands. Like they say, there was over 3,000 people there. And I've read that in the old newspapers of San Diego. And there was a reprint of that in 1987, is when I first saw it, about that. And they were cheered on by everyone, and it was a real breakthrough in terms of women surfing too. She was the very first woman to surf in the United States. So it was a sensation at the time, and those guys continued to sort of build clubs up and down the coast, but the biggest and strongest club eventually ended up being the Wind and Sea Surf Club, which is still today a very revered surf club in La Jolla. And one of the people who started that was a gentleman named Woody Ekstrom. And Woody just recently died. You may have read in the papers, it was a big deal. He was like a front page headline of Woody dying because he had been surfing since the 20s. He was almost 100. He was in his 90s. Still fit, and Sharp and his brother Carl Ekstrom, who's quite a few years younger, started a surfboard manufacturing shop in La Jolla. You know about it?
I know Carl.
Oh,
because
good. Yeah.
He's the son-in-law of my best female friend in La Jolla.
There you go. Okay. Well, so Carl developed one of the unusual designs in surfing called it asymmetrical, which he decided that boards shouldn't have the same shapes on one rail as the other, because if you're going right, you're going to surf it one way, and if you're going backside, it's different. And that's been something that's been used all the way through snowboards, which will often have like an asymmetrical shape to them because of the backside, front side, toe and heel design elements. So perhaps the biggest first in San Diego history in the beginning was big wave surfing. Because it was so cold up north, a lot of the people that were surfing up there didn't go out on really big days because it was freezing, and it was easy to get hypothermia if you got caught and you lost your board. Remember, no one had leashes in these days, so they had a lot to worry about. But at the Tijuana Sloughs, they could have these big waves. And so a gentleman named Dempsey Holder discovered the Tijuana Sloughs and began surfing there and bringing friends down. And this, of course, was when Tijuana was a tiny little village, so there wasn't a lot of pollution coming out of the Tijuana River, but that river mouth brought all of the sand that built these banks and went way out into the ocean, and we would create these huge monster waves there. And so the very first surfing historian was a guy named John Elwell, which I'm sure you guys maybe have heard as well, but he began documenting all of these different things for not only San Diego, but up and down the coast. And there are pictures of him. Oh, here's Woody Ekstrom. I'm sorry, I'm missing your. Go again to a slide, and we'll see who's next. So here they are surfing the Tijuana Sloughs, right there, and that guy in the very front there is Dempsey Holder. Go to the next slide. Okay, so in John Elwell's time. Shoot, that should be Bob Simmons. Let's just talk about Bob Simmons for a second, so we got the slide up of him. So Bob Simmons was also a guy that in the 30s and then later 40s, and was a very prominent guy, and he was one of the most influential shapers in all of surfing's history. He was the first guy to ever do two fins on a surfboard. He was the first guy to ever have a handle on a surfboard. The first guy to ever use hydrodynamics in the concept of shaping surfboards. And he learned that because during the Second World War, he worked at one of the big aircraft factories. And at that time, they were building, they were changing the way they were building the big bombers and using balsa wood for their wings because it was so much lighter than the steel, and that meant they could put more ordnance in the board in the belly of the plane, so they could drop more bombs and not have it weigh down so much. So they could put another 1,000 pounds of bombs into the belly of the plane by reducing the weight of the wings. But what he found then was that he was constructing these and he was shaping them and realizing that the idea of aerodynamics, which is what they were developing in those days, was exactly the same as the concept of hydrodynamics. They work exactly the same way. Flat surface, curved top gives you lift, makes speed. So he began taking all that he learned from the aeronautics world during World War II and also the materials. So he had discovered fiberglass, which they were just beginning to use then, and balsa. So at the end of World War II, because they never knew when it was going to end, there were giant warehouses full of balsa wood up in the Redondo area. And one of the reasons that the South Bay was such a huge manufacturing center for surfboards during that time is because it was really close to the balsa. But Simmons would go up there and bring them down here and shape, and Wind and Sea was a sort of a perfect spot for him to try out all of his designs. So these you can see right here. These are the first what are called sandwich boards, was when, because balsa and also most other wood, but balsa because it's so light, it's also porous. So they needed to seal them, or else they would just get waterlogged. The water would eventually absorb, and then they wouldn't be light anymore. So that's one of the very first boards that you're looking at there. That is both a fiberglass and balsa. So it's called a sandwich board because of that. So Simmons really, and he designs and did so many things that a lot of people call him the Da Vinci of surfing. He was just a designer and tinkerer, and he had a bad arm. By bad, I mean he had I'm not even quite sure what you call it, but it only ended at his elbow. So he had kind of a pincer that he held it with, and so he designed the very first handles, so he could push through waves with that arm and paddle with the other, and also so he could guide his board in when he was laying flat. And he eventually one day was killed at Windansea, at a place called Horseshoe, which is just north of Windansea, the break of Windansea, very shallow reef, and no one knows exactly what happened because he was surfing by himself at the time. But he eventually died, and that sort of also gave him the Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin kind of lease on legacy. That he was revered from then on as this amazing designer. But all those boards then began to change in the mid-50s when foam was beginning to become something that was used in a whole bunch of different aspects of business. And they were trying to build foam. They had designed a bunch of different foam, but they hadn't found one that would work with any other materials on it. So it was very brittle, when you get packing crates, that have foam in it, and you just bang it and it breaks off, and you can just crush it up and it falls apart. They were looking for something that, one, would be a lot denser than that and with a lot more tensile strength, and also one that would allow them to use fiberglass to seal the foam in it. And when they did find that, it was a chemist who came to Hobie Alter, who's not a San Diego guy, but once that was found, the biggest manufacturers here in San Diego immediately jumped on that and began mass producing surfboards. And the effect of that was really huge. We'll go to the next slide here in a minute. So there's John Elwell, sorry. And the effect was really huge because people like Phil Edwards, who was born and raised in Oceanside, then were able to get these lighter, more maneuverable boards that were made out of foam and fiberglass. And that seems like such a small thing now, but it's kind of like the difference between having steamships and sailing ships, or wooden boats and steel boats. It was a mega leap in terms of not only the performance of the boards, but also the productivity that could provide the supply for this huge demand that was just sitting there. And at some point, there's only so many boards you can shape with an axe and in wood. But once they had the fiberglass boards, they could make 100 boards a day instead of 100 boards a year. And that really changed because it allowed the supply to meet the demand. And that was when the big boom in surfing really, really happened. And Phil Edwards was an Oceanside guy who was considered all through the 50s as being the finest surfer in the world. He was a shaper. He went to Hawaii. He was the very first guy to surf pipeline on a board like that, if you can believe it. A long sort of very little rocker and very little down rail on it at all. So to do that is sort of like walking a tightrope with a 50-pound pack on your back, I guess. To make a comparison. And Phil was, without a doubt, one of the finest surfers. And proof positive is there's a statue now made of him, and you can see it, of that very famous photograph that was taken of him in Oceanside, and that's in Dana Point now at the Doheny Park. So another gentleman who was really famous here, you can switch it again, is Pat Curran. And Pat Curran was born in Encinitas and grew up there, but moved to Hawaii in the early 50s and began surfing Waimea. He was one of the first 5 surfers that surfed Waimea Bay, along with Greg Knoll and Mickey Munoz and some of the other guys. But he's probably best known for being the father of Tommy Curran, who was a 3-time world champion and considered to be one of the probably 10 greatest surfers of all time, if not maybe the greatest surfer of all time, depending on who you talk to. But Pat made a really, really great contribution called the Gun. And it was a board that was harder rails, longer, and had a pintail built specifically for surfing Waimea Bay and specifically for surfing big waves. And so they asked him one day why he called it a gun, and he said because you don't hunt elephants with a BB gun. So big guns is what he was making, and that was the idea of riding Waimea Bay. So then we can switch to our first really great woman surfer. Not only was she the first great woman surfer in San Diego, but she was perhaps the greatest surfer of her era, of the sort of late 50s, early 60s. Linda Benson. She was from Encinitas. She watched her brothers surf all through their younger years and decided she loved it and did it. She went to Hawaii for the first time in 1958. Had never been out of Encinitas before, went to Hawaii, entered the Makaha International Surfing Contest, which was at the time considered sort of the world contest. People from all over the world came to compete there. She was 15. She won the contest, and the next couple of days, Waimea got really big. So she went over to Waimea Bay, which was on the north shore, Makaha, where they had the Makaha International, is on the west side. So she went over to the north shore, and John Severson was taking pictures, and he said to her, if you go out, I'll shoot you and I'll print you in my magazine. He had just sort of started, it wasn't even a magazine yet, it were these little booklets that he had that he passed out at his movies. So Linda Benson said, I don't have a board. So John said, well, borrow mine. So Linda Benson at 15 went out at Waimea Bay with a borrowed board and was the first woman to surf Waimea. There's no photograph of her, but there are video, but I couldn't really get a screen grab that didn't completely fall apart. So anyway, Linda Benson was an amazing, and still is today. Linda is, I think she's 80, still surfing, still fit, unbelievable, and still surfs really well. And a fabulous lady. Mike Hinson, you see here, you might recognize that photograph right there. It was turned into the poster for the Endless Summer, and that's Mike, the one here, so he and the other gentleman there went around the world with Bruce Brown and made the Endless Summer, which, by the way, just was recognized by the Smithsonian a couple of years ago as the seminal, I'm trying to get this right, the seminal sports documentary ever made, meaning it was the one that influenced every other sports documentary after that, by its style and how well it was done. So and Mike is a La Jolla guy. He developed a board called the Redfin, which was very famous and was a design. And people always used to ask him, why do you call it a redfin? And he said, well, pretty obvious. They said, yeah, but why do you make it a redfin? And he said, because when you're out on a really big day and you lose your board, he said, it always flips upside down. He said, if you have a red fin, you can find your board. Otherwise, you're just swimming around out there looking for it. So that was the red fin, and a lot of people bought that after he told them that story. But Mike was from there. You can switch. So this is Wind and Sea. I'm sure many of you will recognize it, but it was sort of the first epicenter of San Diego surfing. The club there, as I mentioned, was a huge thing. Bush Van Arsdalen, you can switch, was from La Jolla. He went to Hawaii as well. In those days, and even still today, everyone kind of makes their mark or reaches a certain level of success by going to Hawaii and proving what they can do there. And so Butch went and was one of the very first people to surf Pipeline. He was the very first person to be called Mr. Pipeline. So there's a new book out of his, which we had up at the California Surf Museum. We had him come and speak. Of course, Butch is long gone now, but he was an extremely colorful character, and also the first lifeguard at Pipeline. So, and again, a number of firsts that San Diego can claim proudly. You can switch. After that, surfing really kind of exploded in the sort of early to mid '60s with all kinds of boards, and you see ones that a lot of them are from Hansen and Weber and Bing and Gordon Smith, who was the largest manufacturer here in San Diego, and Larry Gordon. Next slide. Was sort of the premier shaper and board builder in San Diego at that time. Now there are many others, so I don't mean to slight, and I should also say that there's going to be a lot of people that you're going to ask me about that are left out of this, but we could spend 4 hours here if we talked about all the people that are important in San Diego surfing history. But Larry Gordon is undoubtedly the sort of maestro of surfboard building, and probably more boards have been built by Gordon and Smith than as much as anybody else, but even more importantly, so many shapers began at Gordon and Smith. Almost every great shaper in San Diego cut their teeth with Gordon and Smith, and Larry gave them their start there. They learned their craft and then moved on to make their own brands, but without Larry's influence and without that chance to get started, a lot of them never would have been able to be anything more than backyard garage built boards. So now we're going to talk about another first, and that was that San Diego was the very first city, very first place in all of the United States to have a world surfing contest. In 1966, this lady, and she was a complete character, named Miss Billy Riley, went to the Chamber of Commerce and said, I think we should have a world surfing contest. Surfing's really hot, it's the new latest cool thing, and we're trying to attract tourism to San Diego, so let's do a surf contest. And they were really skeptical because in 1961 apparently there'd been a semi-melee at Wind and Sea where like hundreds of kids had come, and it made the papers nationally, and it was the first sort of step towards surfing being bad boys. But it really was about changing their wetsuits in people's front yards and trampling their flower beds that got everyone upset. They weren't burning down houses or anything, but the world contest was a really huge success, and Miss Billy Riley was the person totally responsible for it. She was the head of the tourist authority at the time, so the city fathers kind of had to listen to her, and she was this, she would not take no for an answer, and she brought the contest to there and to San Diego, and it was held in Ocean Beach, and she said, "Don't worry, I'll get the surfers to behave," and she took all the surfers that were competitors there from Peru and Japan and Mexico and Hawaii and Argentina and all over France and all over the world, and said, "You boys are going to behave." Of course, the girls didn't have any trouble with that, so they weren't a problem. But she also was smart enough to bring Duka Hanamoku to the world contest, and he was such a revered character, not only in surfing but everywhere, that it made it absolutely impossible for anyone to kind of act up, so to speak. And I'll tell you a funny story just about why I say both in surfing and beyond is that I was about 12 then, and we didn't live near the beach, unfortunately, but I was begging my mom and dad, "Please take me down there. Take me to the contest. There's all these famous guys. There's Jock Sullivan, there's Joey Cabell, and there's Corky Carroll." And my mom and dad were going, and I had learned to surf overseas, so my parents thought, well, because we lived in the islands, everyone surfed in and there, and everyone went to the beach there. But when they moved back to California for me to start high school, they thought, let's get on with like the studying part of your life and not be goofing off anymore. So I was trying to think of a way to do it. And I said, well, Duke Kahanamoku is going to be there. And my mother said, Duke Kahanamoku? And I said, yeah. She said, we'll go. Because my mom had seen Duke Kahanamoku win shatter all these records as a swimmer, and then go around the world introducing surfing. And so for her, that was okay. We could go see Duke. You know, all these other people didn't matter at all to her, were the people I wanted to see. But I got to shake Duke Kahanamoku's hand, and 2 years later he died. So I feel privileged that I got to meet the guy and talk to him for a few minutes at that time. He didn't give. He didn't sign autographs. He just talked and shook your hand, and so it was like a personal interaction, which is very Hawaiian, you know, and very personal, and was really had an aura about him that you'd walk away and never forget the guy. So at that point in time, surfing was sort of really hitting its stride, and it was also a time, as we know, that, you know, sort of 66 to 69 was this giant period of upheaval in everything in the world and all over the world, but particularly in Southern California. You know, boards went short, hair went long, you know, drugs came in, you know, the Vietnam War was boiling over, and, you know, thousands and thousands of 18-year-olds were, you know, not looking forward to leaving surfing and going to, you know, to Vietnam. And just an aside about that, we did an exhibit at the museum a few years ago about surfing during the Vietnam War, and they always call it the California War because they say there were so many, an outsized number of the soldiers that went to Vietnam were from California, and a huge number of those were surfers. And they said they were trying to figure out why that was, and they realized that, one, they were all about 18, two, they were super fit, and they weren't in school. So they were prime, but also they were so used to reading the environment around them, knowing what the outside swell was doing, knowing what the wind was doing, knowing what the tides were doing, that they made great reconnaissance soldiers. When they went out on patrol, they could read everything because that's what they do when they're sitting in the water. And so an inordinate number of surfers went to Vietnam and served, and they had a beach there that was made famous called China Beach, where surfers were surfing. But the point, I guess, is that there was this huge upheaval in what was happening both in society and in surfing itself, and the smaller boards, you know, the quest for better equipment, for experimentation, for performance, and doing different things, and also for the equipment and the materials like wetsuits, better board shorts. Everyone was sort of really looking at surfing then as a market to serve, and so that became a huge boom. We'll move our stuff, and so things like skateboarding came in. This is a guy named Skip Fry, which you probably are familiar with. His wife was the mayor of San Diego at one point in time and ran for council and actually won, but they didn't circle the right zones on their vote. So even though she had 1,000 more votes than the other guy, they didn't do it exactly right, even though everyone knew that it was the write-in candidate. So they checked the write-in candidate, wrote her name in, but didn't circle it. Therefore, those were invalidated. So, but Skip himself was the sort of the master stylist, and as you can see here, he also popularized skateboarding in San Diego to a great deal, and that's a flex skateboard that was designed by Gordon Smith, and this is him surfing at the ranch. So a lot of firsts again about, you know, the people in San Diego kind of leading the way can change the. So the World Contest was so important when it came in '66 because it did something that had never been done before. It used it as a testing benchmark for a completely different style of surfing. Before the 1966 contest, everyone had surfed like this. The idea was to surf horizontally across the wave. So you turned, pulled up, ran to the nose, you know, got into trim, and rode horizontally across the wave. What you see here is Nat Young, who came from Australia, And although everyone thinks of it as the advent of the shortboard, the board he wrote it on was actually a 9-foot board. But as you can see, he's not surfing horizontally, he's surfing vertically. So the idea then was that boards would go straight up the face and back down rather than across the wave face. And that completely changed the way people perceived how you could surf. And what happened was he won the contest, which totally validated that new concept. Was that valid or not? Well, he won the world title on it. So bingo, everyone went short. And that's when that whole upheaval I was talking about, started to come. So at that point in time, there was a huge amount of experimentation and innovation you can change. This is a picture of that first contest and all the people on the beach. You can see it, and very, very interesting time. Go ahead and change.
That's Ocean Beach?
Pardon, that was Ocean Beach, yeah. And the woman who won that contest was Joyce Hoffman. Now, Joyce was originally from Orange County, but she was the very first woman San Diego lifeguard. And I talked to a number of the guys that lifeguarded with her, and they said, when you try out for a lifeguard, it doesn't matter what. They don't care about anything except your performance. And he said she was number one. She beat all of the guys. So she got onto the lifeguard stands, but she also won the 1966 World Contest, won this Triumph Spitfire. That's her. And today, just like with Phil Edwards, there's a statue of her made now. And it's interesting how in California, people talk about what's the influence of surfing in California. Well, if you go to Alabama, you're going to see a statue of a soldier from the Civil War, riding on his horse. If you go to California, you're going to see surfers who won world titles, and that's how much influence surfing has had on our society. So as that innovation became more and more prominent, you can change. You have people like Mike Doyle, and surfing really, really big waves, and he had an impact on San Diego surfing, not only from a standpoint of being what they call an Iron Man, meaning he could swim, run, and ride waves and go through that whole circuit of Ironman work, and he was hands down the greatest of those guys at that time. But he also brought along a little protege, you can change to, Margot Oberg. Now again, I'm going to talk about just firsts in San Diego, but Margot Oberg, just think about this for a second. In 1968, Margot Oberg had won a world title. She had been number one in the surfer pool. She had won every single contest that was held in that era, and she had ridden Big Sunset for the first time for any woman, and had been on ABC television, and she had not graduated from high school yet. That's something that you just have to think about. And when she lost, which was in 1970, she was so devastated because she had been so used to winning that it almost crushed her, and she retired from surfing when she got second. Because she just thought her life was over, at 18. So go ahead, you can change we talked about Carl Ekstrom. This is a picture of Carl Ekstrom today. Carl is still shaping amazing surfboards that are collector's items now all through. He was shaping boards at that time that were very, very innovative, as I was saying before, the asymmetricals. But the board that really revolutionized surfing more than probably any other board of that era can change. Oh, sorry, I'm out of sync. So another first is this gentleman right here, Jeff Devine. He was from La Jolla. He was the very first sort of what we would call star photographer. He was the, I don't even know, like the Ansel Adams of surf photography. He did shots like this one here and a million others that you can see. He had more covers than any other person in surfing history, and he also was my photo editor at Surfer, and a really fun guy to work with. We traveled all over the world together, and was a really terrific traveler and friend, and still is. But it's another first in San Diego. Was the first great, surf photographer. Okay, we'll change one more. But the really big innovation, this is where I thought I was, the really big innovation was the fish. It was designed by a kid, I say kid because you can see him there, he's pretty young at the time. Stevie Liss was his name. He was from Point Loma. He surfed Sunset Cliffs. And I just happened to be going to college at what was then Cal Western. It's now Church of the Nazarene University on Point Loma. But it's a huge wave field, one of the best anywhere, especially for north swells and big surf. And he was a guy who started out as a kneeboarder and then realized that because these boards were wide and flat, you could stand up on them, and completely changed the way surfing really is done today by the innovation of both the double fin and the fish tails and the big flat wide board that will plane and skate and really fly. And again, proof positive of what it was is that 2 years later, Mark Richards from Australia took one of his templates. Actually, it was one by Reno Lavalera, but Reno had taken it from Stevie Liss and then passed it on to Mark Richards, and Mark made a twin fin surfboard and won 4 world titles in a row on that board, kind of proving that those boards work, and revolutionize the style of it. So as you can switch. So the next world contest that was held was in 1972, and once again it was held in San Diego, and this time it was a disaster. The first one had been a huge triumph. The second one, only like 6 years later, was just a catastrophe, and it was a lot of reasons why. One, they didn't have Miss Billie Riley. Two, times had really changed. As I said, hair had gone long and boards had gone short and kids had gone radical, and the whole counterculture was kind of blowing up, and there was a huge backlash against competition, where before competition had been something that was really respected. At that point in time, competition was looked on as promoting something that, for most surfers, they didn't want more people in the water. They didn't want it to get more popular. They didn't want, any of that. They just wanted everyone to go home and let them surf, because they were all used to surfing in less crowded conditions. And as things got more and more crowded, surfers became more and more frustrated, and they saw the contest as being the perpetrator of that. And on top of that, David Nuuhiwa, who at the time was both in 1966 and in 1972, was still considered maybe the best surfer in the world, and he had transitioned from the longboard era in 1966, which he had lost to Nat Young in that contest as a nose rider instead of Nat Young riding the very vertical waves. He had transitioned to short boards, but he had taken the fish, and all of the guys at Sunset Cliffs at that time really took affront at that he was sort of stealing their design. So they stole his board, and he had to surf on another board throughout the contest, ended up not winning. But the kicker of it all was that the guy who did win, the Sunset Cliffs guys had given a fish to. So he won on the same board in that 1972 World Contest, but not David Nuuhiwa, because he didn't have the board that he had planned to ride to do it. So the contest was a mess. It was held in terrible surf. It was underfunded. They had all kinds of issues and problems, and it kind of, even though it seems like a very short time now, it kind of killed surf competition until about 1976, when the professional circuit started. And the professional circuit meant that guys were getting paid, whereas at the 66 and 68 and 70 and 72 contests, they were amateurs, and you had to pay your own way and find your own your own way around, and no one there to support you in terms of brands and so forth. By 76, it was a completely different story, And so also by that time, everyone had figured out that there was a huge market for products for surfers. And so the next, that picture of her was Sharon Wolf, and she won the women's side of the 1972 World Contest. That's why I put her in there. And she was a phenomenal surfer, is completely forgotten in history, and she won 2 world titles. And you could ask a million people if they know who Sharon Wolf was, and they'd look around at you. But really a really talented, fabulous young surfer. But then OP came, and although there had been Hang Ten and there had been other brands, Birdwell Britches and so forth, that had been surf canvassed by Caton, but the thing that OP did that revolutionized the surf industry, as we call it, was that Jim Jinks, who was the founder of it and had been working for Don Hansen at Hansen's, knew that there was something missing about a surf shop, and that was surf shops had surfboards and maybe some wax. That was it. And and so all the Hang Tens, there was never a Hang Ten shirt ever hanging in a surf shop. They were sold at, I remember, because when I was a kid buying them, it was at Jacobson's Menswear or Bill Gamble's Menswear. That was where the clothing products were sold in clothing stores. And Jim Jinks had the foresight and the salesmanship to go to all the surf shops and say, look, a surfboard costs $100 to make, and you're selling it for $140. That's the markup you're getting. You can buy this T-shirt from me for $2 and sell it for $10. Like, which one of these things do you want to invest in? And they kind of went, oh yeah, that would be good. Let's make some money. So that was when Jim Jinks was able to take Ocean Pacific as a brand and put it into surf shops, and that changed the industry entirely, because at that point in time, then surf shops became really lucrative, really successful enterprises as a store. Before that, they were just sort of a place to sell boards that you got out of your factory. It was the storefront of the factory that whoever, the Greg Knoll or Gordon Smith or whoever, Surfboards Hawaii, whoever it might be, would be. So Ocean Pacific kind of revolutionized that, and the very first woman surfer, you can change again. Oh, so this is Ocean Pacific. This is the Ocean Pacific contest that they held at Huntington Beach. And this is just, honestly, it looks like a lot of people. It's only a very small portion. You can keep pulling this back and back and back. There were over 200,000 people at this, and there were only 500,000 people at Woodstock, and they make a big deal out of it, But everybody came to see the OP, and so it really put surf clothing on the map. And after that, Quiksilver and Billabong and Rip Curl and O'Neill and all the big brands began making clothes and became very, very successful with it. And the surf industry, as we know it today, is really the garment industry. The surfboards themselves were never a huge business, but they were very, very instrumental, and especially in San Diego. So Barbie Barron, you can change it to the next one. You guys have probably seen this if you've driven through Carlsbad on Coast Highway right there. But Barbie Barron was the first woman to open a surf shop. It's one of the oldest surf shops now left in San Diego, and a really popular one as well. And so another first, she was the very first woman to own a surf shop, and that was in San Diego. And then for a biggie, we can go to the next slide here. Someone who was from the San Diego area and totally revolutionized the idea of what wave riding was about, and probably introduced more people to the idea of riding a wave than any other single person in history. Sold millions and millions of these little boogie boards, and Tom Morey, he again just recently passed away. A really fantastic guy, brilliant thinker and philosopher king, but also a really brilliant scientist and designer, and made these boards. There he's holding the very, very first one he made, and you can't tell from that, but that's actually made from newspapers. He took newspapers and glued them together because then he could shape it. He didn't know what else. He didn't have the materials yet that he wanted, so he did that, and that was his sort of latest model that was state of the art. again, a San Diego, company based in San Diego here. And then we can go to Donald Takayama. Donald died not long ago as well. The California Surf Museum just did a big retrospective on him, and it was very well received. We'll go to the next slide here real quickly and just run through. But Donald was there. Joy Moran, the very first guy to ever California to ever win a pipeline contest, the Pipe Masters, was from San Diego. And then change it again. And the very first woman to win a world title is from San Diego. That's Debbie Beacham. She's another really fantastic and talented young lady. Just real quick story on her, but if you ever wonder about what it takes to be a world contest winner, Debbie was out before her heat for the world title, and she got a wipeout. Her board hit her in the ribs, broke her rib. She came in, and they said, "Well, you can't surf." She said, "Yes, I can." She had a doctor wrap her up. She went back out for her heat, and on her third wave, her board snapped in half. She swam in, got her board, started to paddle out, and mercifully, the heat bell rang. But that's how determined and how brave Debbie Beacham is, and that's at Big Sunset, where probably any of us in here would be not even wanting to go out. Much bigger day than that. Next slide. This is Fernando Aguirre. He lives in San Diego for 40 years. He's originally from Argentina, but he started Reef Sandals, which is the largest sandal company in the world, and also brought surfing to the Olympics. Again, a San Diego gentleman right here. And change your slide through. This is Brad Gerlach. He was number 2 in the world, a San Diego surfer, one of the few surfers to get that high in the world contest circuit. He's the guy on the far right there with it. Switching, we'll go quick. This is Taylor Knox. He was the first one to win a double XL award for a 50-foot wave. That's him riding it at Toyota Santos. So again, a first for San Diego. Go ahead. And this is Cora Schumacher. She's a 3-time world longboard champion. Again, a fantastic story. She was on her way to Costa Rica for the world title, and she was someone ran across the road. It hit her head on. She flipped her car. Her windshield broke. She was slid on her body across with the window smashed. Came out with scabs all over her. Spent one day in the hospital. Got up, put duct tape on herself. Flew to the contest. Went out and surfed it. Kept winning heat after heat after heat. And the scabs that were on her started just peeling off. And everyone on the beach was cheering and screaming for it. She won the contest, and that was her first world title. So, these are people that, go ahead, you can change the title. Joel Tudor, perhaps the greatest longboard surfer ever. Even though he's a contemporary, he's gone far beyond all of the old longboard surfers to become what is considered to be the best longboard surfer in the world. You can change it. And lastly, this brings us right up to the contemporary time. This is Jen Smith, a 2-time world champion longboard surfer that lives right here in San Diego. And that kind of brings us, get one more shot. That's Rob Machado, and that's surfing history in San Diego. Thank you.